Okay, right. The next part of this tape and the next 20 minutes, what I'm going to do is give a brief description and discussion on the ABLOY system, and that is primarily going to be the ABLOY system as it features on page 24 and 25 of the catalogue, which is the original ABLOY system that I made up until about 3 or 4 months ago. Since then, I have developed an additional system, which I'm going to show on the next tape, which is a vast improvement on the original system that is in here. If a customer was to ask me for equipment to defeat ABLOYs, I would, however, still sell both systems, which would be quite an expensive thing to do. But there are advantages in this system which are not necessarily dispelled by the fact that I've now invented a new system. So I'm going to go sort of back several years, and first of all go over as best as I can the ABLOY system that you see here in the box on page 25. Now, ABLOY is a company that has been around for a long time, and over the years, the locks that they make have changed. The system that you see here in this box was designed over a sort of year or so period, and it's been now available, commercially available, for at least, I would say, 5, maybe 6 years. The system is designed to be used on the following locks. The original ABLOY, which had a semicircular shaped keyway, and the diameter or the straight side of that semicircular keyway on the original version of the lock was a 6mm diameter. So it is a 6mm diameter semicircle, and that was the profile of the keyway. That was produced up until quite a while back. I'd say at least 12 years, maybe a bit longer. Well, in fact, probably was quite a bit longer than that, I don't know, but and then what they did was they introduced a slightly larger diameter semicircular keyway, which had along the straight edge, it had a small sort of profile. So the actual diameter of the semicircle was 7.5mm, and it has this squiggly profile. That profile, however, is only on the top disc, and there's a sort of modified profile that is only on the bottom disc, and the tip of the key has a little sort of slot cut out of it to engage on the bottom disc. The discs in between those two discs do not have any profile on them, but the diameter of the lock was slightly larger. So this was the first version of the lock. This was the second version lock, and both of these locks worked on exactly the same principle. They had 6 angles of the discs, and most of the locks had 11 discs. There are some locks that had 9 discs, and there were some locks that had less discs than that, but the majority of the locks were 11 disc locks. The bottom disc was always a 0, and that bottom 0 would only turn 90 degrees. The top disc, however, is a free spinning disc and will just go round and round. The reason why that top disc was free spinning was that some guy in Japan or in Hong Kong did make a tool to defeat that lock, and he was using the top disc to apply torque, and then he was using like a semicircular tipped and quarter circle shaft pick to twist the discs and get them into various positions. That was a long time ago, and since then that particular system doesn't work because the top disc is now free spinning. Anyway, since the original version of the lock, which we will call the semicircular keyways if you want, was developed, ABLOY then went on to another version of the lock, which was this lock you see here, which is called the ABLOY disc lock. Now, the ABLOY disc lock was only produced for a very short period of time. It had a fundamental flaw in that the key could be turned before it was fully inserted into the bottom of the lock. And this meant that what was happening is that people were going to their lock, putting the key in, not putting it to the bottom, and then trying to turn the key. And what that was causing was damage to the 2 control bars that controlled the stack of discs. And they were getting all sorts of malfunctions and problems that were being caused by this. So they very quickly withdrew the disc lock and then introduced what is known as the Disc Lock Pro, which is a virtually identical mechanism. It's just that with this lock you cannot begin to turn the key until the key is fully inside the lock. They tightened up the tolerances, they tightened up the shape of the keyway. There was no longer this faceplate that was visible on the face of the lock that turned with the key. There's now a hole, and the only thing that turns is the top disc, the disc controller, and the mechanism below that disc controller, which is slightly different from the disc lock. Now, the contents of this kit enable you to open the original version, the 7.5mm profiled version, and the ABLOY disc lock, but it will not work on the ABLOY disc lock Pro. After I developed the original first three components, I then realized that the part of the system could be adapted for use on the ABUS Granite, which is really nothing to do with ABLOY, but it is a lock which has a very, very similar kind of mechanism. So I put that into the kit. So if you have this system, or if you buy this system, it will work on the ABUS Granite, the ABLOY disc lock, and the two original versions of the semicircular keyway. That's the straight one and the profiled. But it will not work on the ABLOY disc lock Pro. If you wish to defeat the ABLOY disc lock Pro, you have to get the ABLOY disc lock Pro decoder, which is a tool which was specifically designed for doing the ABLOY disc lock Pro. And that system consists of a decoder, and then later on I developed a variable key which enables you to actually build up the key itself and then use that key to open the lock. So you have a decoder which gives you the code, a variable key, and then you insert the variable key into the lock and you open it. We'll talk about that probably tomorrow on another tape. Primarily today I want to concentrate on the two original versions of the lock. Now I don't have one of these systems with me here to show you. I have sold at least 25, probably as many as 30 systems around the world, and really all I want to cover is the advantages and disadvantages of the system. The main disadvantage of the system is that it is particularly difficult to teach. It is something that I would usually teach over the space of 4 or maybe 5 days to a class of no more than 4 students. The lock, even within the different generations I've explained, in particular with relation to the original version of the lock, there were many design changes. The original version of the lock had discs that were non-reversible, and this meant that the discs had to go into the lock a certain way up to achieve the 6 different codes, which were 0 and 1 to 5. That's the way that they were numbered. Several years after the original version was made, somebody realized that by putting the tag on the disc in a different position, you could make the discs reversible. So a 0 could be put into the lock one way up and it would be a 0, and then if it was put in the other way up it would become a 5, and then a 1 would become a 4, and a 2 would become a 3. So then the company only had to actually manufacture 3 different discs to achieve the 6 codes. That, in actual fact, was a major saving for the company, but because the locks were slightly different in the way that they worked, it meant that the system I was using no longer was effective, and I had to introduce another system. So within the kit, what you have is you have several different decoders. What you have is a shim wire decoder, which works by introducing a wire, a very thin wire, between the discs and underneath the spacers, and the spacers inside this lock were shaped a bit like upside down soup plates. In other words, there was a gap. If you imagine an upside down soup plate with a hole through the middle, there would be, once you went through that hole, a little sort of pocket underneath, and as you progressed along that little pocket, then the top of the plate would sort of taper down, and then there would be a lip that was in contact with the lower disc. The original version of the lock that I made, or original version of the decoder that I made, used those spacers to introduce a wire, and then that wire could be sent out at different directions, and if there was a gate there, I could use that wire to identify that there was a gate at a particular angle, and that subsequently it would be a particular code. That's the way that particular original system worked. The problem with that is that the factory assembled locks had all the spacers in the same way up, but the ones that had been assembled by the locksmiths in their shops it wasn't relevant to them which way up the spacers went. So if you found that the spacer was introduced into the lock the wrong way up, the wire wouldn't be able to pass through in the way that it was supposed to. So again, that system wouldn't work. Then I introduced the bar decoder, which worked in a similar way, but it was a hard bar that was being slid between the discs and then rotated, and then the little sort of nipple on the end of that bar would drop into the gate, it would stop, and it would give you an angle which would then confirm what the code of that disc was. The problem with the bar decoder is that it does cause very distinct forensic scratching on the surfaces of the discs. If you dismantled a lock, and some of these locks can be dismantled once you've got them open, and you was to examine the discs, you could instantly say that that particular lock had been decoded with a full safe decoder. So what we had was a complicated system. It was complicated when you arrived at the lock, because you had to do a sort of 5-minute long analysis of the lock to identify whether the lock had large, medium or small discs, reversible or non-reversible discs, whether the lock had 11, had 10 or had 9 or less discs. All of these things had to be identified before you could then go to the decoder and pull out the necessary equipment. You would then have to use the equipment to identify the code. If the lock had non-reversible discs, this would be a procedure that would probably take about 9 or 10 minutes. If it had reversible discs, however, it could take as long as 30 minutes, because you had to decode the discs twice to look for zeros, ones and twos, and then after that to look for threes, fours and fives. So the whole procedure was much, much longer. And then, having achieved the code, you then had to return to the lock with a key or with the auto dialer that was in here to dial up the discs into the correct position for opening. So all in all, the system was a long drawn out system and was not ideal. Okay, so basically, you know, without going into too much depth, the system has its merits. There are things that you can only do with this system. If you were to come up against one of these kind of rare ABLOY disc locks, the only thing that I have to open the disc lock is the tool that is contained in this kit, which again works by introducing a bar between the discs, turning that bar until it drops into the gate and gives you an angled reading. Also, there is, if I flip back into the commercial section of my brochure here, there is a problem with the Abbas granites. The Abbas granite lock that you see in these, or the Abbas granite locks that you see in these two diagrams, are basically the exact same mechanism as each other. There are 9 discs, and there is always a 6 at the bottom and always a 6 at the top. It's based on basically on an ABLOY principle. Now, the ABLOY kit that you saw does have in it attachments which will enable you to decode these two locks. However, later on, having developed the ABLOY system, I then went on and developed this system, which is a commercial tool, which is a pick for the Abbas granite. Now, this pick is much easier and quicker to use, and if I was to have to go out and open any of these two Abbas granites, I would indeed use this this 2-in-1 wheel pick. It will open the lock. I can usually open the lock in 3 or 4 minutes, and having opened the lock, you can then determine the code so that you can go away and make a key. However, there is a problem with this tool in that it is substantially less effective on the ABLOY disc lock, sorry, on the Abbas disc lock, which is a 6-disc version of this lock, and that particular lock doesn't have a 6 at the bottom, and it doesn't have necessarily a 6 at the top either. So this particular tool is not effective on that lock. There's also a motorcycle lock, which you see here, which also has 6 discs, and there isn't a 6 at the bottom. So this system is not an effective system against those two versions of the lock. However, the older way that I was doing it, which is using the ABLOY decoder, is effective on those locks. So if you were to come up against an Abbas discus lock and it didn't have a 6 at the bottom, you would not be able to use that ABLOY, that Abbas 2-in-1 pick, but you would be able to use the attachment that comes inside this kit. So I would still recommend to people that if you want to cover 100% the ABLOY Granite and the entire ABLOY range up until the ABLOY Disc Lock Pro, that you would purchase this system and the two new systems for reasons that, again, I will go into in a little bit more depth when we get into those. If you want to do the ABLOY Disc Lock Pro, you would then need to get the ABLOY Disc Lock Pro decoder, which is a standalone system specifically for that lock. And then the only lock you would not be able to defeat would be the ABLOY Executive, which is the latest lock that ABLOY make, and I yet, or to this date so far, I haven't actually developed a system for that lock. Really, it's quite rare, and I haven't got round to working on it yet. But if you want to do the ABLOY Executive, you'll have to wait until I develop a system for that. So what we can cover is everything that ABLOY make up until the Executive. And I'll try and sort of cover that in the best way I can. I can't describe the disc lock. I can't describe how the tool is used on the ABLOY Granite. And I can't describe how it's used on the two original versions as far as this system is concerned, because I don't have one in front of me. What I can do, and what I will do next, is cover the use of the new systems as they are used against the original and then the updated 7.5mm version of the lock. Now, one final point before I get onto that is that I noticed towards the end of the production time that they started producing, they don't actually make this lock anymore. There's still hundreds of them out there. They still do manufacture the 7.5mm diameter profiled version. But I started noticing a few years ago that what they started to introduce into this lock was that the spacers between the discs were actually flat pieces of steel that were 0.5mm thick. They were no longer this upside down plate shape. Now, the advantage of the upside down plate from the point of view of my decoders was that the plate was eminently squashable. You could squash it flat. And by doing that, you could compress the discs and make space, and into that space you could introduce the bars or the wires. When they introduced these flat spacers, you couldn't create a gap. So if you came across any of these locks, because you could put new spacers into old locks, you could not use any of these older systems. The only way to open should we say a very modern version of the older lock would be to use this new system. And this new system is really what I'm going to cover next. So this new system, which is nothing to do with bars or wires, it is in effect a pin and cam system for an ABLOY lock, will work on both versions of this lock. Obviously there's two systems, there's one for this and one for this, but they're both identical. And the new system works irrespective of whether the lock has got large, medium or small diameter discs, irrespective of whether discs are reversible or non-reversible, and irrespective of what type of spacers are contained between the discs inside the lock. It also doesn't care whether there is 11, 10, 9 or any other quantity of discs, as long as there isn't more than 11, and I don't know of any locks that did have more than 11. And also the advantage of it is that it is much easier to teach. This system can be learned easily within a day. It is much more covert, it causes no forensic damage to the lock whatsoever, and it opens the lock as well as gives you the code. So unlike this system where you had to use it to get the code and then you had to go away and make a key, or you had to return and dial up the code, this system does the whole thing in one go. You use the system, at the moment the lock opens, you will have the code on the end of the key, and you can then go away and make a key if you want to, or you can just use the tool to open the lock in the normal way. So that's what I'm going to cover next, and we will call that the ABLOY pin and cam system, which is what I've come to call it now. All I'm going to cover is the one that I've got, which is the one for the original version. The other system, which is for the 7.5mm diameter version, I haven't got in front of me at the moment, but it basically is exactly the same. It's just got a profile introduced into it. So we'll stop this now, and then I'll set up that for demonstration. Okay. Right. In the kit, that is the auto dialer in the top left-hand corner.
Okay.
and that's what you use to open the lock once you've got the code. This is the shim wire decoder, which relies on the spacers being the right way up for it to work. That is the bar decoder, which is only used on these two locks, but it doesn't matter which way up the spacers are, unless of course they're solid spacers, in which case it won't work. And this is the ABLOY disc lock decoder, which is only for use against this. And then on the other side you've got the ABLOY disc lock pro decoder, which is for the one that is more common these days. If you go into a shop these days and buy an ABLOY lock, it's more likely to be an ABLOY disc lock pro, and you would need that newer system. Okay. But that is all explained in the literature that comes with that. So, okay, this next tape here is on the use of the